Hi, this is a video in my series on Plato, and this video is about Plato's theory of the forms and why it doesn't exist. For those of you who've heard my ancient Greek philosophy course, you'll be familiar with some of this material, but I'm going to present it in a slightly different way, and this will be a short video, and I'll do more of them as part of my Plato series. So for those of you who are new to Plato or who've heard of Plato, you probably know that one thing we all associate with Plato, if we have any sort of contact with him academically, is that he has something called a theory of forms. And people try to explain this theory of forms, and then it's often routinely dismissed in introductory philosophy courses by many professors. And I want to start by explaining why that's possible, and what the theory of forms is presented as meaning and why it doesn't exist in that way. And then in a second video, in sort of part of this, I'll present a little bit about what the theory of forms actually is, or what it means or should mean, and I'll tease at that at the end of this video. So Plato's theory of forms generally is just presented as a set of ideas that Plato has, that behind every sort of reality in some sense, like a physical reality, like a cup like this, the idea that's attributed to Plato is that there is a form of this cup, a kind of invisible structure of this cup. And that's basically the foundational idea of the Platonic theory of forms. And one of the most common examples given when explaining this, which I use myself in my teaching, is of a chair, say, where we have the idea of a chair, which is an idea that the word idea goes back to Plato. It's one of the most important ideas in the world, the idea of an idea. It's a Platonic idea. And there's a history of the idea that goes from Plato to Hegel, who culminates it. And it's really kind of an essential idea for understanding the history of science and culture. But I'm not going to talk about Platonic idea or ideas right now, just the Platonic forms as we discuss them in academic philosophy typically. So that's the idea. You could say you don't have to have a physical chair to understand the idea of a chair. And if you want to build a chair, then you have to understand the idea of a physical chair. So far, so good. In fact, when you say that, it's hard to see why anyone would argue with it. It's also important to realize it's a very insightful thing that no one had kind of put that clearly. So in one sense, a lot of the non-interest or lack of understanding of the Platonic theory of forms is that it seems obvious insofar as we can understand it. And so it's sort of hard for the mind to grip onto it. But I want to suggest that really deep things do seem obvious once we understand them, and that can make it easy to underestimate their significance and easy to not think about their implications, and therefore also easy to not properly credit people who helped us understand those ideas or who gave us those ideas in the first place. So this idea of the forms, this concept of the forms, is what's commonly taught, and there's a basic plausibility to it. But then people will raise all these problems. You may have heard about them, the third man problem in Aristotle and other things that I'll discuss in different contexts. So fair enough, but you could say, what's the big deal about any of this? Well, first of all, the Platonic theory of forms is not a theory. It is not a theory in any traditional sense. The Platonic theory of forms has to do with what the word theory originally meant, and it has to do with what the word form originally meant in Greek. And that's a difficult issue because we translate a few different Greek words in Plato and Aristotle, for example, with the word form, and it's not always consistent. So I want to talk about what the Platonic theory of forms teaches us, even in the academic way of understanding it that we're commonly given, but then explain why that way of explaining it is really only a tiny bit of what Plato's doing, and it's not the main idea. It's not the main emphasis of the idea. So what it gives us is the idea that behind the visible is an invisible pattern. And this is very profound, but it's usually weirdly not explained clearly. The main distinction that Plato consistently uses is not a discussion of forms and their embodiment, although there's a basis for that way of talking. It's the distinction between the visible and the invisible. And that distinction maps in Plato on the distinction between things that change and things that don't change. And that maps onto a distinction between the eternal, things that don't change, and the temporal, things that are in time, which therefore by definition are subject to change. So those three things itself are very powerful, and they're usually not coordinated into a unified account of Plato's theory of the forms. If you're taught Plato and you're not taught to think in a basic way between the idea of visible manifestations and invisible patterns, then you're missing something. Now you could say, well, Sam, that is kind of in the idea that we're presented with. And I agree. And insofar as a person kind of even understands that, it's quite useful. But then people will raise obvious objections. They'll say, well, what does that mean that there's a form of this cup? Where is the form of the cup? What does it mean? How are all of the cups related? Do they each have a different form? How are those forms related? These are really difficult questions. But in order to understand those questions, we need to understand, first of all, this central idea that a theory in our sense implies an account of something, in this case, an account of Plato's forms. And Plato's idea of theory is not like that. Plato does not have the word theory in the way we understand it. He certainly would understand our idea of theory, but our idea of theory is a kind of intellectual overlay that might help us understand something even if it's not identical to it. So think about the theory of evolution. We mean by that really close to over 150 years now of development, particularly from the work of Darwin. If you just read Darwin and said that I understand the theory of evolution, you would be correct, but you couldn't go into a biology classroom now, 100 plus years later, and understand contemporary evolutionary biology. So when we talk about the theory of evolution, it's very important that you specify in a context what you mean. You could mean the whole theory as it's developed, but then you would need to take account of what we call neo-Darwinian biology and the sort of neo-Darwinian revolution. So when you talk about a theory in the modern scientific concept, it's extremely misleading to present Plato as having a theory of forms. Why is that? Well, it has to do with the word theory itself and its centrality in the Platonic worldview. The Platonic world emerged in a world that was still full of gods and temples, which were extremely important. And at the center of most traditional temples was a cult image, an object or idol that symbolized the god, or might have even been something that people believed the god was somehow present in. And this is the essential historical context to understand what Plato's account of the forms is even embedded in historically. And if that's not understood, then there's no real understanding of what he's saying. So that's a first component, is there's a very specific context, which you see, for example, very clearly in the Timaeus, if you're familiar with this great work of Plato, where the whole cosmos is presented as using a specific Greek word as a kind of temple or cosmos that visibly embodies the radiance of its divine origin. So the theory of the forms for Plato, if it's a real historical presentation of Plato's work, has to be embedded in what you could call Plato's creation account, or Plato's account of the formation and development of the world. Insofar as you just rely on the very simple abstract idea I started with, what you're really dealing with already is what we would today call the philosophy of mathematics. And I want to make that very clear, because if you separate Plato's account of what he calls the forms from what we today call mathematics, you're not at all interested in what Plato was interested in. And when people do that, it becomes easy to sort of make up silly criticisms of the account that Plato doesn't give, that people will then attribute to Plato out of context and not understand that all of the difficulties of Plato's account of the forms have to do with his own fundamental attempt to understand some of the deepest questions anyone can possibly understand. But none of them were rooted in the idea that there was just this notion that he had, a kind of concept, and then he kind of tests it out and criticizes it, but maybe he's not really committed to it. Maybe he is. That is not the case. Why? Because for Plato, the idea of pattern, which is a better way to understand form, to make it a little less familiar, the idea of pattern is obviously fundamental. Anyone who seeks to understand the manifest or visible world will have to understand invisible patterns. And the basic, of course, template for that in the ancient world that Plato was part of, and that was essential to Plato's way of thinking, was mathematics, in at least the sense of arithmetic and geometry. So it's quite clear that the way we bring order to things typically is through number. So Plato's theory of the forms, if you're going to get into it historically, even as a specific theory, is much closer to the contemporary philosophy of mathematics than it is to most of the things in contemporary metaphysics. Even though, of course, the philosophy of mathematics is deeply metaphysical, those questions. So the idea of form as pattern is in one sense very fundamental, and it is indeed the idea of an invisible order that's manifest in the visible order. And I want to suggest to you that Plato's view about this is that this is just true, and unless a person understands this, they can't learn science or philosophy. Because the whole idea of learning is that you approach something that you don't understand, and then by examining it, you come to a deeper understanding. But think about if we examine a physical object like this cup. If I describe the properties of this cup so that a person can understand what a cup is who hasn't seen it and could even create a cup, then I'm going to describe it using words that point to concepts which are intrinsically invisible, even though they can be manifest. For example, I could say that this cup is cylindrical. Now think about the idea of the cylindrical, right? It's a geometrical idea that already has been predicated on the creation of the first two dimensions, right? From the point to the line, and then you'll get a bounded figure, and then you can add the dimension of depth, right? And you go from a two-dimensional figure to something like, in this case, a spherical container, which can have volume. In this case, of course, it's holding my tea or my lemon water. So if I describe what a mug is, I can describe it in terms of, you could say, mathematical or geometrical properties, spatial properties, like it's cylindrical, it has a bottom, it has sides that are designed to hold liquid, etc., right? And then we could specify it also in terms of its function, which is extremely important to Plato. Plato believes in a method of identifying things by their function, which is unique to them. So in order to understand pattern or form in Plato's sense, part of what you're trying to understand is what is the unique distinguishing function of this thing. And Plato thinks if you don't understand that or don't have a reasonable account of it, you're not anywhere close to understanding the pattern or form of something. A third dimension of pattern and form that's not typically taught at all in Plato's so-called theory of the forms, even though it's essential, is that the forms are what we would today call causative, or they create effects. So the forms are not inert. The forms are templates and patterns which you use to build things, just as a potter is building and creating with their hands and their clay or whatever material it is. They're creating a material form based on an intellectual form. And in that way of presenting it, you could say, well, Plato's obviously just right about that. But what does that have to do with a theory? And the answer is it doesn't have anything to do with a theory. The word theory in Plato, Theoria, the Greek word that we get our word from theory from, which we still use, it's derived, you could say, as a kind of like slow, long forgetting, but still connected directly to Plato's use of Theoria. Theoria has, as a fundamental sense, direct vision. So here's what's funny. Platonic Theoria is the opposite of modern theory. You have a theory exactly when you don't have vision. You have a theory when you don't have true theoria. If you have true theoria, you are beholding directly the origin, cause, purpose, and unity of that which you have sought to understand. And therefore, you possess a kind of unified connection with that which you seek to understand. And you can demonstrate that unified connection in appropriate context. So it's not something made up. It doesn't mean people will understand it, right? Think about mathematical demonstration. Mathematicians who really understand ideas can completely demonstrate them in the most rigorous way to someone interested in learning, but a person has to be able to follow it. And it has nothing to do with the proof or the demonstration, whether a person can understand it or not. If they just don't want to learn mathematics or they don't want to learn the requisite material, it still can be shown. So we have to make a very strong distinction between what can be shown and the conditions under which what is shown can be understood. Things that are very difficult can be shown, but they can't be understood by people who aren't willing to learn. So the Platonic theory of forms, properly speaking, would designate the high point or the apex and goal of human understanding as Plato understands it, which is when the when the mind takes on a kind of divine quality of direct apprehension. And so, for example, in intellectual creativity or artistic creativity, this is often that aha moment that people have where they suddenly have an insight into something and then they seek to work it out. And we find this as a pattern, not just in science and art, but that they seem to share the same logic as many of the greatest writers and scholars in recent times in particular have shown. There's no real fundamental difference, I think, between true creativity. It involves sort of being given or being in pursuit of some understanding, some pattern that will bring a bunch of disparate things together and allow you to see their connection. But then you have to figure out what is that connection. And even if you see it, until you have a reason to count, what Plato calls first a name, you have to have a name for the thing so you can designate it clearly. And then you need what he calls a logos. These are two of the sort of 3 or 4 components he identifies in what I would say is the origin of the so-called scientific method in Plato's 7th letter, which then Aristotle uses. And basically it's still, I think, one of the most useful accounts of what does it mean to understand anything, particularly in what we would say is a scientific way. You need to be able to designate it clearly, at least, like have a word for what you don't understand, right? Like you can say a unicorn and then ask, do unicorns exist? You could also say, are there horse-like magical creatures with a single long horn, and do they exist? Well, then we would say, well, let's be clear what we're talking about and come up with a name for that. Well, we have a name. It's a unicorn. We have an account of what a unicorn is, a kind of very special, very beautiful, pure, magical creature, has a lot of special properties in our history and mythology. And then you can ask the question, does that thing exist? Now, so far you could say we have a theory or an idea about unicorns, but you could only have Theoria, you could say, of a unicorn if you actually saw the true nature of what a unicorn is, which would not just be seeing its visible form, but presumably wouldn't be anything less than that. So one of the great mysteries of the idea of Theoria is that Theoria is what binds together the unity of the invisible or the latent and the hidden and the causative or originating and the manifest or the visible and the appearing. And true understanding in Plato's way of teaching people involves a person growing into the capacity to perceive directly invisible structure when they see visible things. And when the difference between the invisible and the visible disappears, and you see them as a single continuum of the pattern becoming manifest through a material process that brings it into being in a way that we can see and touch, then you have understanding. And when you have deep understanding, you have understanding that would allow you to sort of create in the relevant context an image of what you understand. So a proof of an understanding in Plato's sense is that you can actually create an image of the thing that you understand. Whether you should do that or not is a different question. So Plato's theory of the forms is really actually about fundamental vision and what it would mean to have a unified, harmonious relationship between the visible world and the invisible world that brings the visible world into being. So there isn't really a theory of forms. There's rather a journey in which the human becomes capable of living in 2 different worlds. The world that somehow produces what we see with our eyes, and the world that is manifest from that world. In other words, you get a new insight into what's visible by understanding what it is. And in understanding what it is, you get insight into the invisible structure of the world. So it's as if you can see the light that is shining when you see something. Like when you see my face, you're seeing an image of my face, many mediations through. You're seeing an image of me on a camera. You're also seeing an image of my body. What you're seeing isn't my true body, right? Unless the body is just a physical optic impression that the surface of our bodies create, we never see even the fullness of a person's body. The body itself has a fundamentally invisible nature, as all real things do, but it is also fundamentally a visible object. But the concept of our bodies are often just linked to people's visible surfaces, when that's just the surface that hits our eyes and that we form impressions of with our minds. The true body, like everything, is invisible. So understanding form for Plato means you gain access to a unifying, harmonizing vision that enables you to live simultaneously in the world of the invisible world of pattern and creation and cause, and the visible world of effect and manifestation. So I hope that that's helpful to you, and I'll talk more in some other videos about some of these things. And if you're interested in this and want more on the context, check out my course on ancient Greek philosophy with Learn 25 and the other videos. Thank you so much for joining me. I'm Samuel Loncar. This is part of the Becoming Human project. You can learn more about my work at www.samuelloncar.com. You can support this work at Patreon, and you can also study with me if you're interested in that. You can find more information at my website. Thanks so much.